I will just introduce myself. I am Olivia Cooper, use she, her pronouns. I am a PhD candidate at UT Austin, and I am also co-chair of the Climate Change Committee with Suchi, who is also online, of Astrobites. And this year we have our second Earth Week, so Earth Week by Astrobites 2023. We have a fun lineup of incredible speakers to share with you today. Today we have Martin, who will be discussing the Six Americas strategy. And our theme this year is really leveraging our platform as a science communication platform and putting together astronomy and climate change in this way from the perspective of science communicators. So we're focused on how to effectively talk about climate change from the perspective of a science-involved person. So I'm really excited for today's session. And Martin, maybe if you could go ahead and introduce yourself, who you are and what you're up to.
Yes, thank you. And apologies, this is really unusual. I don't know what glitch we have that prevents my computer to get in at this point in time. So this is an interesting Zoom for me then, Zoom webinar, because I can't see anything. And that reminds me I'm working on two projects with blind and visually impaired. And at this point in time, I am blind to what's going on. So this provides me an empathetic experience for people who don't have that possibility. So Martin Storksdieck is my name. I run the STEM Research Center at Oregon State University. We are 17 people who do all sorts of things, held together by the belief that when you understand how people learn things, you can better help people facilitate the learning process. And we do this in all sorts of settings, and we do it with the philosophy of knowing that people learn in all sorts of settings, that learning is connected through time and space, and that it is oftentimes free choice, individual, and based on people's interests, their motivations, and the way they see themselves or also themselves. And much of what we do is environmental related, though not the only focus that we have. But what brings me here is the work I did on climate education, starting with my dissertation 25 years ago. I worked on climate-related planetarium shows, and I ran the Climate Change Education Roundtable at the National Academy of Sciences with my very distinguished colleague, Paul Stern, who is an amazing thinker in this field. And so that's me. We're very few people here. I don't know whether it's okay that people quickly say who they are, but I'm not sure that's possible.
Yeah. If folks want to, we only have a few audience members in the Zoom. No pressure to speak up. Maybe people could write in the chat. Do you have access to that, Martin? I can just.
No, I can, but it's okay. It's okay. I can fly a little blind if that's and start maybe the presentation before we get into the conversation.
I have your slides pulled up, so I think everyone's looking at the title slide right now. And maybe we'll just have you go through the slides, and you just prompt me to go to the next one, and I will flip forward. And at the end, we can open up to discussion and Q&A.
Okay, fantastic. So today the topic is basically to really reflect on what audience segmentation or understanding the particular needs of particular audiences may do to the way in which you want to talk to them. And when I think about communication, I think about that in a two-way street. Right? What is it that you want to convey, but also what do you want to learn from your audience? And I want to start this by saying, imagine you try to convince somebody, you have a conversation with somebody about climate-related issues, and here you are trying to convince someone how important it is and all the science that's there, but they don't really care anymore because what they want to know is, what can I do? And you can bore them to tears, and you just talk aside from what their needs are by focusing on the wrong topic. Imagine you're doing the same thing. You're trying to convince somebody, giving them all the research and all the details about what climate change is and the scientific evidence for that. But the more you talk, the more you alienate them because they want to know, why should I trust you? That's what we're talking about today. And what's fantastic is that, particularly around climate, there is actually work being done to help us very, very distinctly understand who these sub-audiences are, who these segments of society are that might help us as practitioners or as researchers begin to target the way in which we engage with people by what their real needs are. We don't really work from our perspective as in, I have this to give and that's all I have to give, no matter what you need, but more turn this around to an audience-centered. That's what this conversation is about. And with that, the Six Americas study. Let's go and just introduce briefly, next slide, if you can see how people might think about and feel about climate change, six segments of American public. If you can see this artwork by Michael Sloan, then you see six terms: alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. And that's what we're going to be talking about. It means that, and I'll get to that, a major research study conducted at Yale in collaboration with George Mason University has begun to ask thousands of people dozens and more questions about climate, what they do, what they feel, what they think, and then parse people into six distinct groups. It's the alarmed, as the word says. They're already with you. They realize there's something going on and they worry about it. The concerned are there. They know it's going on. They believe that. They're not quite where they would act. The cautious, they still need more convincing. The disengaged, they're the ones who just don't pay attention and nothing around them shows them that anything is going on. The doubtful, they don't believe necessarily that the research is so clear and tells, but they don't believe necessarily that you're evil. And the dismissive, these are people who very strongly believe there's no such thing as climate change happening, and for sure not done by humans. And in fact, the people who say so have an agenda. That is their agenda that is running against what they believe in and what their life is about. This work, next slide, is not my work. It is the work of and the brainchild of two people I admire very much for what they do and what they contribute to climate change research and climate change education and communication. It's Tony Lyserowitz at Yale, who runs the project on climate communication and the Global Warming Six America study, and Ed Maybach, who is the lead and his partner at George Mason University. Both of them have huge teams. Check them out on the website. They're great people, do good work, and have been doing this now for 15 years. Next slide. What does it all mean? I kind of signaled that already. You should see the slide again with the alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. Is that okay still? Is that what we see?
Yes.
If that's okay, then press one more, and you should see an arrow that goes from the alarmed to a text box. Is that so?
Yes.
Okay. Well, this is basically who the alarmed are, and a little more detail. They are convinced global warming is happening, that it's human caused, it's an urgent threat, and they strongly support climate policies. Most, however, do not know what they or others can do to solve the problem. They may know the whole shenanigan of possibilities, but they're really concerned about what they can do at this point in time. And they wonder and worry about actions they can take at all levels of society. The concerned, you press the next button, as I was saying, they think global warming is happening. It's a serious threat. They support climate change policies, but they're not quite there where they realize the urgency. And that means it's a barrier prioritizing what they do in terms of everyday action or who they support. But they're with you. They don't need more science about it necessarily. They might need to know why it is a threat they need to be paying attention to right now. The cautious really haven't yet made up their mind. Is global warming really happening? Is it human caused? Probably. Is it serious? We don't know. And this doubtful place, of course, has been played to a lot. If you have some doubt about stuff, you're not entirely convinced, it's easier to put it aside. It's easier to lower prioritize it. it's easier to make excuses for why you don't do what you do. It's still possible. It's still possible that our dog really went to a beautiful, beautiful place in the countryside. It didn't die when I was 5. It's possible. So I won't emotionally engage with the fact that my dog might have died when I was 5, because there is such a place on the countryside where dogs happily live ever after. The disengaged, if you're at this arrow now, they know very little about it. They are not exposed to this. Where they live, there are no conversations around this. This is not a topic. And if they come across it, they will not pay attention. The doubtful, as I said, they do not think it's happening or that it's human caused. And if there's anything going on, yes, there are data, that is all part of natural cycles. They don't really much think about this. They don't see it as a serious issue. And here's the good news, but at least they don't think that this is all a big ruse and primarily an evil conspiracy against their way of life and who they are. Because that's what the dismissive think. So they really reject the idea of global warming in all of its parts. And furthermore, they believe it is indeed a conspiracy, many of them. Some form of conspiracy thinking that says this is done to undermine who they are. And they really don't like you when you talk about it. So that's the groups. Let's take them in, because for a moment, let's try to put that into your short-term memory if you don't already have it. But roughly, I think the terms were chosen relatively well for this, because the next slide, you should now see how they fall within the US population. And this is the project's latest survey, and they've done surveys now for more than 10 years. You can see how it falls, and there's some really good news in it. The good news is that there's quite a few people, namely 2/3 of the population, who do not reject it. So a quarter of the population is alarmed. These are people ready to act. Another quarter or more is with you. They don't have to be convinced. What they need is a bit of a push to act. The cautious, they would need education that shows them this is really serious. The disengaged, you just have to find new ways to make them pay attention. You're not likely going to succeed. The doubtful 11% and dismissive 11% means that about a little more than a fifth of the population are truly not with you. And it's not very likely that you will have much of a chance with the typical forms of science communication to get to them. The alternative means that have to be found. Next slide. This has been going on for a very long time. So what we have here is a slide that shows us how these audience segmentations over time have changed. And it's a bit complicated, looks a little bit like modern art. Take it in as modern art. But briefly, what it shows you is the overall development of the last 10 years, going from left to right. We start with the alarmed. That group went from 12% in 2012 to now 26%. That means the group went from 1 in 8 to roughly 1 in 4. Increasingly more, like a quarter of the US population is really at the point where they're ready to act, and they do act. And if you help them, they will act more. We see that the concerned have stayed somewhat stable in terms of the percentage. People, of course, move between those. This is not following one person over time. This is random samples at different intervals. We don't see how people individually move along this and how you can move them along their perspective, but this tells you what the population thinks. We see that the cautions have diminished dramatically, 12 percent points. And that shows you that there's a shift, more or less, within the group of people who are with you in the last 10 years. Previous surveys have shown much less encouraging results. But we can see here that within the people who are roughly with you, the number of, or the percentage of people willing to act and ready to act have increased dramatically. And unfortunately, the disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive over the last 10 years have stayed fairly stable. And that is primarily because that is so tied to where they are in society and who they are that they're just not receptive. Okay, next slide. Not surprisingly, in part because that's how these segments have been created. This is a complicated slide. I'll walk you through the blue line that goes from high to low, from left to right. Attitudinal valence, meaning how do I feel about this stuff? What is my perspective on it? From alarm to dismissive, of course, declines. But whether it's linear, this is the symbolic. What's more important for climate education and communication is the red line, the issue involvement, the degree to which people might actually pay attention. And what you find, and that's not necessarily whether they will pay attention, but if you engage them, what will happen? So you find that the people on the alarmed and somewhat on the concerned side are really willing to engage with you in conversations. They will take on information in a positive sense. Of course, you can see that line going down for cautious and disengaged, as the name says. They're not really engaging. It takes a fairly different approach to try and get them to pay attention. And then engagement goes up again when they don't like you, when they don't like the issue. When you poke them, they're being triggered, and that means they're likely arguing against it. And they will not change their perspective. Next slide. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're paying attention. And as you can see here, attention paid to global warming information, blue is good, red is bad. You can see pay attention a lot is dark blue, pay attention some is light blue, and then with light red and dark red. You can see, as would be expected, that the alarmed and the concerned pay attention, that the alarmed pay a lot of attention, and that it moves as would be predicted down, and that in the doubtful and the dismissive, people are not paying attention, actually. If you get them to talk to you, they'll be arguing, but to get them to talk to you will be a bit difficult. And as you can see with disengaged, yes, that's what it means to be disengaged. They're not paying attention, but they don't have these strong feelings about it. Next slide. How does this translate into climate communication? Is what we're talking about here right now, of course, is the cultural values of these 6 Americas. And they're very much aligned with similar studies that look at cultural values and political orientation. And it's not surprising if blue is the kind of communal sense that people have and values that are communal. And here it's called egalitarianism. It means you support common good kind of arguments. And the nature and environment and so on and so forth. And individualism it's about me, it's about competition, it's about my rights, it's about the American way of life in a very traditional and John Wayne kind of way. Then you can see how these are diverging a little bit. That's not atypical, but it's an indication that the underlying issues are not knowing signs. The underlying issues are, what is my cultural value system? Next slide. This is complicated modern art again, but it's interesting. Again, you see on the top, alarmed, concerned go again from left to right to dismissive. And what you're asking here is, if you can ask a question to a climate scientist, what direction would that question take? This is, of course, coded in complicated ways, but you can see, as was actually predicted by what we talked before, the alarm would want to know, what can I do? Actions that I can take. The concerned are also asking these questions, but they ask a little bit more about consequences and causes. In the cautious, you can see it goes across. They want to know for evidence, they want to know everything a little bit. The disengaged, if they were to engage at all, would probably want to know more about evidence. And you can see how in the doubtful and dismissive is really all about, they're going to be arguing about whether it's actually happening. They're not asking questions in the dismissive what to do about it, because they don't believe there's anything to do about it. Next slide. This is one of the little snippets, but it again says, the lower one is, in general, I don't like to read or hear anything about global warming. Let's take that question and see. The only 10% of the alarms say that that's the case, likely because it's emotionally draining, while the dismissive, 72%, more than two, almost 3/4 say, I don't like to hear and read about this stuff, probably because it annoys them. And then there's anything in between. And when it comes to, I have difficulty understanding news reports about global warming, it is not surprising that the disengaged and the cautious have higher numbers. Getting their mind wrapped around what this is not necessarily something that is in their court, and the disengaged particularly. Like, this is something, partially why they might be disengaged is not only because it doesn't exist in their world, but also because it's hard for them to comprehend. Notice that the alarmed and dismissive don't have difficulties because they're pretty convinced that they have the answer to these things in either way, either direction. Next slide. That's the second to last slide before we can potentially have some conversation. How does this translate into questions? Questions they have when you want to engage with them. Next button, the alarmed, you should see questions that the alarmed have. They ask, what should I do? And how can I do that? The concerned asks, why do I have to act now? And what are easy things I can do? What are the low-hanging fruits? They're not really ready to change their life, but they would do small things. The cautious really are on the fence. What is the overwhelming evidence? Convince me that I should really care. I am open to this conversation, but I'm not quite where I will act. The disengaged, well, tell me more. This is me being desperate. The disengaged really need alternate forms of engaging with the topic. They're not going to engage with climate change. They might engage with other topics, other framings in which climate change then plays a role. There you have to circuitously get to their way of paying attention. So climate change might be something that says, hey, there is more damage and flooding here. That's something that you care about. Yes, I care about the flooding in my community. What can we do about it? And then you bring stuff in like that. The doubtful, why should I pay attention? What might be, and there's the same thing as the disengaged. There is probably, you probably can't get them to be convinced about climate change directly, but it's the indirect topics that come from, that might actually link climate change to something they care about. And frankly, the dismissive ask, why should I talk to you or trust you? What do we have in common? There is no conversation about climate change. There is a conversation about who you are, what science is, and why what you have to offer, if you have to offer anything, is not evil. They really have to be convinced of that. And that brings me to the last one slide over. How does that translate into climate communication? I have a few words that come up. The first one is, if you click on it, show interest. We oftentimes use a deficit model of communication in science that says the other person does not have something I have to give, I'm going to give it to them. Instead of asking what is it that they need, what is it that they want, where can I connect with them, and how can I learn from them? And why should somebody listen to you if you don't listen to them? So if you're not interested in them, why should they be interested in your stuff? Show interest. Ask questions. The next thing, click on it. Next thing, listen and learn. I click again and say, take the other seriously, don't dismiss them. I click again and say, be a person, be nice. You represent that. And finally, if you click one more time, don't try to win. In any of these, the long haul is, and the long-term success is what you want. In 2023, I started climate education 28 years ago. I've never seen that trying to convince people in the moment has ever been really successful. It is putting another pebble into a wall, a foundation for people to act, is giving them another step that they can take. And it is not it might be frustrating, but it's never wrong that you leave somebody who is not convinced. You might make them think a little, or you might make them like you. So that's what I learned from the 6 Americas. And with that, we have a little time to ask questions and run through scenarios, or for you to share what you've experienced and your sense of audience segmentation, or maybe questions about this that I can clarify. Thank you. And that's it.
Thank you, Martin. You're getting applause. Can pass reacts. I have questions. I'm sure audience members have questions, and folks are welcome to put things in the chat and I will read them, or you're welcome to speak up either way. If you raise your hand, I'll call on you, or you can just speak up. So we have one in the chat I will start with. Someone's asking, how can we restore hope or energy to the concerned but burned out group?
That is how do you create hope in the burnout? So that brings up a bigger question, and I think it has to do with community and personal well-being. I mean, hope probably is not an individual. The way I see it, at least, it comes oftentimes from community, from being with like-minded people, from celebrating small successes, from sometimes also looking at the larger, bigger picture. I do think that there is a risk, and there is now lots of research done on the psychology on children, that the gloomy picture makes people become disengaged. I sometimes think about this in terms of the broader range of history and how while it's urgent and while things will happen that are bad, that's a tricky thing. It will be manageable. One of the hope to me comes from being with friends, from being with family, from love, from caring about the other, and from knowing that the planet doesn't die. That framework, by the way, that framing that the planet is dying because of global warming. The planet doesn't give a shit. Sorry for the technical term, about us. The planet will happily live on, as history has shown, under different climate conditions all the time. It is just unpleasant for us, and it's most unpleasant for people who are not us in other countries, in other places in the world. But the hope, I think, really comes from supporting one another. That's the best I can do, because it is a conundrum that you simultaneously say and communicate all the time. Well, if we don't get to 1.5 degrees centigrade and limit it to that, the world will come to serious trouble. And then when we don't, and you use that politically to motivate action at the highest political level, and then when we don't reach it, you kind of are the wolf. You are the sheep that cried wolf all the time. So people get numb to these ideas that if we don't do it by next January, the planet will die. Oops, next January has arrived, the planet is still here. The way I see it is we need to be, in times, realize why we're motivated to do this work. Finding the right balance between doom and gloom, we have to urgently act because disaster is striking, and realizing that disaster is striking slowly, and that you need to be thinking about this in somewhat more complex ways. Sorry, I don't have a very good sense of that, because it is a conundrum in science communication and in our own attitude towards what the problems are. It is simultaneously hopeful and extraordinarily threatening. There's no question about it.
We have a raised hand. Go ahead.
Hi, Martin. Thank you very much for that talk. I'm in London, which is one of the reasons I've got my camera off. It's quite late here. I've almost coming to the end of a Learning for Action course with Terra.do, and that just sort of to add to what you were just saying about how to give hope. I've found increasing my agency in this matter to be a good way of boosting my hope. And I think giving people agency, giving people things that they can do to make a difference, to feel like they're impacting it, is one way of improving people's optimism, because at least you feel like you're doing something in the right direction. But but I wanted to ask you a question, and I don't know whether this is within the remit of this talk, but how do those 6 Americas map elsewhere? Do you know? Because it feels like, and I don't know enough about the US, but in the UK it feels like there's a load more in the disengaged, and by that I mean people for whom it just doesn't get into their top 10 things to worry about, because they've got too much other stuff on their plate. And so I think that's where I'm generally struggling when I talk to people. I think they all acknowledge it, recognize it, and then just think, I've got too much other stuff going on, so leave me alone.
That's a very good question, actually. I'm not sure whether the Climate Project has done international work. Look at their website. They might actually have done something, because they did all sorts of detailed stuff. I would fathom that the categories are the same, that's fundamentally not an American thing. And in fact, one of the things that we found out is that in many of these like dismissive categories, from the kind of conspiracy theorists, people who feel that the elites are trying to attack them in who they are, that exists in England, in France, and it exists in Germany. I'm German, and we just hadn't seen it as much until recently, or not as much. So I think the categories fit. I agree with you that the percentages might be slightly different, but the communication strategies that come with them, and that was my major message, right? They're the same, right? So I agree with you. If Brexit and inflation and whether my kid will have a good education at this point in time, or whatever it is that the disengaged are struggling with that makes them not pay attention, that's the key thing. I hate to say it, but sometimes we always say that in some forms we don't want to scare people. That's true. In my planetarium show, there was a moment of scare. I felt like at that time in the mid-90s, there were a lot of people who were disengaged, and they needed a wake-up call. I have no good evidence, but the problem is when we talk about strategies that say don't shock people, well, yes, there's a whole bunch of people there who don't need to be shocked, but there are probably a bunch of people for whom wake-up calls are what they need, so that their disengagement ends, that it gets higher on their priority list. This could be a threat to you. It might be useful to pay attention. So I agree with you, and I can imagine that the disengaged are a relatively large group in England, given all the things that are going on. You don't have as much as we have here in the United States, the wildfires in the West, that people begin to realize climate change, dry, changing conditions, little differences make gigantic differences in well-being. The hurricanes, the tornadoes, the flooding, there is more going on right now here. I'm not sure how it's in England, but that's how people started paying attention.
No, you're right. When you just mentioned wake-up calls, and I was just thinking, well, actually, we've had lots of IPCC reports and lots of heavy warnings and serious, actually take this seriously, notifications, and I think people are a bit fatigued by them. But the point that you make about the experiencing of extreme weather events, so we had what we would define as a heat wave last summer, which is 40-degree consistent period of 40 degrees centigrade, and that definitely pushed it up the conversation list, and that's people were suddenly then, okay, now it's something that's impacting me on a day-to-day basis. I'm now willing to listen to you again.
And I think you're pointing out to a really probably one of the most successful ways to get people engaged in this. Like, another IPCC report will not do. It's just not having the effect that the people who write these believe they have. This is not how it works. Research papers don't get people's minds and hearts. It isn't. And these big policy things is seen as theater. I don't think it does much. But yeah, the heat wave that went over Europe and in England, that makes people pay attention.
Next raised hand, Viviana.
Hello. Well, yeah, thanks so much for this Great perspective. So I'm an astronomer who's a newbie in climate science. I'm trying to switch my research to climate, actually. And so, I'm trying to learn mostly. And so I had actually two questions. One is, I feel like, some of these communication strategies seems to be directed to the disengaged, the skeptical, and so on, right? While we do have about, half of the people in the US who are apparently just in need of being told what to do. And so my two questions are, one is, what do you think is sort of like the best return? Is it important to engage everybody, which I'm sure is a great goal, or, is it more important to push actions from people who are already, sort of on the right side of this? And the other is, what are the things that people should be doing? I find it very confusing, right? Because there are a zillion possibilities. And I think just waving through what are essentially worthless or, have minimal impact and what is important, I don't know. I find that even, as someone who access to information and so on, I find it very confusing. So I don't know if you have resources to share. I mean, I understand this is a very big question, but yeah, it's hard.
These are two really hard questions you're asking right now. Thank you. The first question.
Sorry.
The first question is an interesting one, because when you consider climate education like much of education or many of the things that are happening out there to try to influence societies in some ways as an ecosystem. The question is not whether there is a global climate communication strategy that anybody could adopt to focus on anybody. The question is, what do you want to do? So this talk, if anything, would suggest to any one of us that you are not likely running a global communication strategy or climate change. If that's what you do, congratulations, you should worry about all six of them. If that's not what you do, then be aware who you're talking to, who are you targeting, and what is it that you have to offer, and what can you learn from them to improve what you will do. So my big plea is to limit your appetite, to bite out the apple only so much as you can chew, is to be more aware where you want to play in this climate communication, climate engagement, climate justice, climate action work. So long as you know these are the people I'm working with right now, that you don't sort of say serve the wrong things, that you don't serve them ice cream and they expected steak, that you don't show them a documentary when they wanted to see a love story. It's that kind of align what you do and limit your self-focus. That will be number one. So that really has to do with know that there are a gazillion other people who do this work, who might actually address other audiences that you cannot address. You don't have to do it all. That's a really important thing.
Yeah.
It's a very crowded field. Lots of people want to do this stuff. So you can choose your niche, number one. Number two, what could one do? I think you're asking a really hard question, to which I have absolutely no answer, but I have my own personal opinion. I was joking for a long time when I gave talks on exactly that question, that if you want somebody who lives in the United States to lower their carbon footprint, make a move to Japan, because that's immediately a reduction of 70% just by them living in Japan, or moving to France. So the context is so driving how much individuals use in terms of how they pollute the world. It's so contextual that it's really hard to say individuals use the best of their judgment to make small changes to their life that cumulatively will then make the planet a better place. It doesn't work that way. It is an important component, as our friend from England has said. Giving people things to do is important, but it's being realistic about how much that is a systemic thing and how much you are caught in the system that you live in. Not everybody can drop out. I was also joking that if you want to do something for the climate, and yeah, this may be sounding, this was much better in talks when I'm on a plenary and there's people in there that shoot me, because I'm an academic who is traveling all the time. I'm an international traveler. whose carbon footprint is an absolute disaster. And I see myself as an action warrior. But I don't do what I ask other people to do. That's another thing to keep in mind. What degree is what we do aligned with our lives? Which brings me to this third one, which is you can only act personally on the margin. You cannot suddenly become a climate hero. You would have to drop out of the life that you live in massive ways in order to make that happen. It doesn't help to drive suddenly like an electric car instead of another. You're still part of this larger system that uses a lot of energy. In my example in Oregon. So what you can do, however, is support the larger structural issues that make things move massively. So your political action is probably likely to do more good than your individual action. And here is, and I'm standing a little bit on a soapbox, because morally people always said, act as you preach. And I'm telling you, don't. Preach and act politically quite different from what you do at home. There is absolutely no shame in realizing that the context within which you live doesn't allow you necessarily to do what you would like to do, but that you would like to change the rules of the game such that you're forced to do what you would love to do. I'll give an example. I love to drive fast. If I'm in Germany and you give me a fast car, I'll drive it as fast as I can. The individual Martin with his urges, with my primordial brain, will want to do that. The political Martin says, I'm supporting the Green Party in its efforts to limit the speed limit on German autobahns to 100 kilometers an hour, so that I am contained in what I do. And I feel this is a really important, personally, this is a personal opinion. I feel it's really important to reflect on these things and then find the action part that has systemic impact, while you also signal to yourself on the margin that you're willing to make your own life marginally different. That's how I would say it.
Thank you. This is very helpful. And, I feel like I really went through this trajectory where I realized, okay, what is it I can do? And I wonder if this is, one of the sources or roots, causes of disengagement, realizing that, like our own individual power is so little. And, I feel like the next step is the ones that I think is hard to make. And so I think this is very helpful just to, give a perspective that is a bit more optimistic and, gives you agency.
Yeah. And it's my personal one, right? After many, many years. So, and maybe I'm just being a hypocrite. So maybe I'm just a hypocrite because I'd like to visit my family in Germany. And so I'm getting on a plane and I'm flying to Germany, and maybe I shouldn't. Maybe that's a terrible thing I'm doing. But that's an important thing to remember. There's also clashing value systems. And we all, so we look at the dismissive oftentimes as the people who have a different political value system than we have, but we have competing value systems within ourselves. And my value system of wanting to be with family clashes with my environmental values. And I am aware of it. And on the margin, I fly less. I still fly. So, but it's that kind of thinking process that I think is important, and to give people the power to think that way.
I think it's acceptable and consistent to campaign for a frequent flyer levy and a carbon tax, and also fly if you it's for good reason, if you see what I mean. If your lifestyle demands it, you can do the two at the same time, and you can say I want this to be more heavily taxed because I want it to be discouraged, so that it's much more of a difficult decision in my mind as to whether I do it or not.
Right. And it gives me cover, for instance. I get asked to fly all the time, but we already have Zoom meetings. We had Zoom meetings before Zoom was very common, because we try to reduce the degree to which we had to go somewhere in order to have a meeting for 2 hours. And I think, so for instance, higher costs give me cover to say, hey, we can't afford it. Let's do this as a video call. I know everyone wants to come together to discuss these issues and then go out for dinner, but we can't afford it. Let's do the other thing.
Yeah, we're rapidly, well, a few of us have got to the conclusion at the end of our Terra course that the single biggest thing we can do is campaign for externalities to be factored into pricing. Because if you factor externalities into pricing, then the economic system starts to adjust itself, and things which are horribly costly to the planet become horribly costly for us to try and do in our day-to-day lives. And there's an alignment there.
Correct.
Any other questions or comments from the audience? I'm really latched onto this idea of the niche that was brought up a moment before, thinking about like your corner of the work to be doing, since there are so many people working in this field and doing this communication, just in the context of specifically Astrobites Climate Committee. And I think many of us in the room are scientists, science communicators. I do think most of our audience is probably in these sort of the alarmed and concerned categories, and just reflecting on the sort of messaging or the content that we've been putting out from Astrobites. A lot of it is, I mean, just based on the structure of Astrobites, a lot of it is reporting on research papers. And I think it is probably good for us to reflect on how can we include more action in those posts and the content that we're putting out in the communication that we're doing, really thinking about who our audience is, because they are seeking out science, and they're probably leaning towards these sort of higher categories.
Yes.
Well, we are at the top of the hour. I don't want to cut off discussion, so I'll wait a moment if folks have any other things they want to discuss. While people are thinking, I will just remind everyone tomorrow at 11:30 Central Time in the US, we have our final event of Earth Week. So I see a question in the chat, I'll come to that next. Final event of Earth Week is a panel, so I'm really looking forward to that. It will be webinar style, recorded as well. So let me just read this question in the chat. I was trying to come up with a question related to what I see as a risk of complacency in some interpretations of long-termism, especially related to near-term environmental disasters and compassion for affected countries and populations. So the question boils down to, how do you talk to a long-termer? We may have lost Martin, I'm not sure.
No, sorry, no, I didn't hear what you said. That's sorry, I got distracted.
Yeah, the question is, how do you talk to a long-termer? So thinking about the risk of complacency in interpretations of long-termism, especially related to near-term environmental disasters and compassion for affected countries and populations.
I'm not sure I fully grasped the question. So how do you interpret the question?
No, I think I understand. I mean, just this might be too technical of a term, but something that I grabbed from an undergrad class is the psychological distance of climate change and changes on these longer than human lifespans.
Oh, I see.
Things happening in other countries, not directly, like if you're someone in California.
Right. Yeah, temporal and spatial distance. It's an abstract thing. It doesn't really influence me. I can put it on the, yes. It's been shown now pretty heavily that is indeed one of the biggest problems, is that it's not concrete. It's abstract, it's distant, it's psychologically distant, it's geographically distant, and so on and so forth. At least it's easy for people to say that. And that is unfortunately why when you have to look at things that happen concretely nearby. That's ultimately what it is. Yes, in some distant future, that problem has been solved insofar as we are saying at this point in time, and we have some scientific evidence that some of the stuff we're seeing right now is already caused by climate change. So in other words, it's not a future anymore. So one of the things that people do here in the United States, for instance, to point out that many of the environmental disasters that we are realizing are actually already signs of climate change. So more of this will come. And if it is not, if you don't accept that this is what climate change will do, then you can say, but then when climate change really kicks in brutally, you will get that a lot. I tell you, wildfires. People are massively concerned about those. So that gets you, that link to things you can experience is normally what breaks that problem. But other than that, it is what it is. Indeed, when you consider that a third of the people in the United States submit their tax return the day it's due, that's what they do everywhere in life. So if you have a problem that might come up next year or in 10 years, you're not going to take it on. It's just a fact of life. And you can, and again, the only way to deal with it is to make it real and now. Point out the things that are happening right now. Will they do anything about it at that moment? Maybe not, probably not. But at least you break that cycle. It's still something that is distant. It is very difficult to make political systems and individuals act on something that might happen in 10 years. That's what it is. I hate to say this, but there is no good solution to this. And that's exactly why we as humans will probably, politically speaking, get to the point where it's become so uncomfortable and so apparent that earlier action would have been better, but we are only acting when we can, when lots of people see it sufficiently that those who make decisions have the backing to say, you got to do this now. I hate to say it, but this is one of those problems where we will act late because of the nature of the problem. Sometimes research can be negative in the sense of, yeah, we have enough evidence to show that this underlying phenomenon is going to really, really make this a tough nut to crack. Oh, that was a not so hopeful perspective.
About when are the taxes due on climate change? I don't know.
Well, it's very difficult to tell people that they need to invest now into something that's speculatively happening in the future. And for those of us who are not economists, many of us are not, think about the so-called discount rate. People discount in their mind, whether you like it or not, whether it's conscious or not conscious, things that happen in the future. It's basically the old trick where you say, do you want $100 now or 100 euros or whatever it is, or do you want 110 in a year? That's why that's exactly what happens. Things that happen in the future are discounted to today. So disasters of the future are being weighed against actual money you might lose now if you see it that way. And that is a real phenomenon. So having people see that this discounting of the future is something that comes at a much higher price now is probably what would fight that. Again, pointing out to actual things happening at this point in time.
Any other questions? All right. Let's thank Martin again. And thank you.
Well, thank you for being here.
The audience for participating and discussing. It's very interesting. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all at the panel tomorrow.
Yes.
Thanks very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.